biggest reason that I existed and the job that I have was so important on the border is because the cartels pay better than we do. When you've got, and the federal government plays very well. I mean, most of your Border Patrol agents are making six-figure salaries, but when those guys are down on the border, any number of people can have money problems, right? You can go through a divorce, you can go through, a bankruptcy, you can go through some sort of issue that makes you vulnerable. And if you have a badge and a gun, that is a very powerful incentive for people on the other side of the border to help you get right, when you go through those problems. And so we saw a fair amount of that. There is always going to be a certain percentage of people who are willing to take that bribe, who are willing to do that favor, who are willing to start down that slippery slope. And having guys like me there to be a check against that is hyper important.
Yeah, and even at six figures, right? There's a big difference in between 200 and 400,000.
Leaders are not born in a womb. They are forged through heat, pressure, and a whole lot of sweat. The Fire Forged Leader podcast serves the audience through exploring leadership at work, in the community, and with the family, using a practical perspective and real-life experiences from the host, Steve Baumgartner, and his guests in the Forge. Now, it's time to enter the Forge with the Fire Forged Leader.
Welcome once again to the Fire Forged Leader podcast. Today we have Kristofor Healey on the podcast. Awesome guy. We were just having some conversations. I'm going to go ahead and let him introduce himself today so that you don't have to hear me ramble on about his bio, how he loves cornflakes and all that sort of thing. So Kristofor, welcome to the podcast. And if you could just tell the guests a little something about yourself.
Hi, thanks for having me, Steve. Yeah, my background, I was a special agent with Department of Homeland Security for over 15 years. I did some work down on the southern border, so I've got some experience with all the chaos and the hectic stuff that's happening down there. I did a lot of public corruption work, worked on various federal task forces, and then I really got into my last 7 or so years of my career was focused on large-scale tele-fraud and money laundering investigations. And so I spent the bulk of my time chasing down the people that are behind the telephone scams that we all hate. Tracked people down all over the world, got to visit some of the world's garden spots, got to go to some of the worst countries and a few decent ones while I was at it. But yeah, that was kind of the bulk of what I did. I led the largest tele-fraud case in U.S. history. It was a case called Operation Outsource, and it was the group of call centers in India that were behind the IRS scam. So if you ever got one of those telephone calls from somebody claiming to be the IRS or the Social Security Administration or anyone else, like millions of other Americans, I was leading the team that fought back against that and actually took down that entire network back in 2016 and then onward into the 2020s. I left the federal government in 2022. I'm now a public speaker and an author. I've written a couple of books. My most recent book is called In Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders. It's a book of Stoic wisdom that I wrote specifically for people who are law enforcement, paramedics, firefighters, to give them something that they could use as a mindset tool on a daily basis, just digestible pieces of Stoic wisdom that they can use and some journal prompts to help them integrate the lessons. That just came out this month. And like I said, I'm a public speaker now with Team Never Quit. I do a lot of keynote addresses all over the nation on behalf of Team Never Quit. It's the most fun I've ever had.
There's a lot to unpack there.
I didn't mention that I'm also a dad and husband, and proudly so. So yeah, we can go into that too if you like.
Yeah, so the dad and husband is probably more work than the rest, right?
Usually that's the case. Yeah, usually that's the case. The work gets to be the fun part. But it's the most rewarding thing that I do as well. I actually left my federal job in 2022 to be a full-time dad and to pursue entrepreneurship alongside my wife, who owns a very successful consulting business in the health and fitness space. But the reason I left was because my father-in-law, who had been a cancer survivor, was diagnosed with terminal cancer. We knew we only had about 18 to maybe 36 months remaining. And my wife had sacrificed so much over the course of my career. She had stepped aside for me. She had moved for my career to advance my career, had taken a back seat while she was building her business so that my career could flourish. And I had the opportunity to step into a more full-time role, to be more of the homeschooling parent, the guy who's hands-on. We have our kids in a homeschool hybrid situation, so I'm teaching a couple days a week and doing that sort of thing. So to step into that role is really the most challenging thing that I've ever done, but also the most rewarding. I absolutely love it. So being in entrepreneurship is a great way to be a more present father in a lot of ways. It's also a tough sled because you are never apart from them. So you are,
Right.
you got to be much more. I guess you really have to be aware. You have to do that. What I used to call in law enforcement, I would call this a threshold check, right? I would come through a doorway. When I was coming home at the end of the day, I would do what I would call a threshold check. Like, where's my attitude? How do I feel before I step into this space? Because I need to, before I take this duty belt off, this duty gear off, before I take this gun off, before I transition into being a father, I need to know that I've got my head right. I'm in the right space. I'm not carrying anything with me in from the day. So that threshold at the doorway was where you would always do that threshold check, that kind of like, how you feeling? How do you feel? Take a breath. Do you need a second? Do you need to sit in the car for a second to make this transition? It's harder to do that when you're an entrepreneur, when you're working in the place that you are parenting your children. So you have to be much more intentional about that. About the dinner table is not a place for this conversation, or walking out of like the bedroom or the office into a family space. You have to be much more intentional about that. So it carries with it some challenges as well.
Do you ever find yourself right at the doorway to your office going out into that family space and go, whoa, stop, back up, sit in the chair for a minute?
Sometimes, yeah. And the toughest part about especially this time of year where, both kids are home full time right now. And, we're, like I said, a homeschool hybrid situation. They're at school a couple days a week. They're at home a couple days a week. So you have that break point where your office actually feels like an office space. This time of year, I've got them in and out all the time. So it's harder. You have to be even more intentional about making sure that space is kind of a sacred space. But yeah, it's basically at 6:00 most nights, Central Standard Time. It's like, okay, this is where, this pen goes down, and, and I take this hat off and I put the other hat on, right? And it's more of a time thing than it is a space thing these days.
I really like that. Just talking about fatherhood and being a parent, that's part of leadership, right? Is making sure that we're fully present for our kids, making sure that we lead at home. But it's different, right? I mean, those relationships are different. And I'm going to take away this threshold check because I need it sometimes as well.
Yeah.
I have the luxury of a 17-minute drive, to and from. So I get to do that in the car. But still, there's certain check marks we should look at before we enter our home, right?
Yeah.
So I'm definitely going to take that away. So I appreciate that, Christopher.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like, when you run a search warrant, when you're with a team and you're clearing rooms and you're going into a home, you can do all your prep work and you do everything that you can to get a feel for what that house is like before you step through the door. Maybe you find an old Zillow or Realtor.com listing and you get a feel for the layout, but you never truly know what you're walking into. And so, every doorway is dangerous. Every threshold is dangerous. And so you kind of do that naturally with the op rhythm. You come up behind somebody and you squeeze their shoulder, let them know you're there, and then take a breath and you clear that next room. And so to incorporate that from my law enforcement career and put it into my personal life was a real advantage. And I feel like there's a lot of that right now in the space where 20 years of the global war on terror, you've got all these guys who have been downrange, who have experienced things, who are coming back and saying, here's some tips, here's some tools, here's some tactics that are directly translatable from a military or a law enforcement career into how you operate on your day-to-day, your day-to-day life, how you operate with your family. And you just got to look for that wisdom where you can find it. And that for me was probably the biggest thing that I took out of my career.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So rewinding a little bit, you told us a whole bunch of stuff in that intro, right? And I want to go back to even pre-southern border, right? How in the hell did you get involved in the Department of Homeland Security?
Oh, it's the fun stuff. Yeah, I was. This'll this will probably shock you, but most people, they get into law enforcement because they have family in law enforcement. It's a a dad was in law enforcement, an uncle, a grandfather, or they've always wanted to since they were a little kid. I didn't feel that way. I didn't have this draw to be in law enforcement from the time I was little. In fact, it was really the crowning moment that made me decide I wanted to be in law enforcement was 9/11. And I grew up in New England. I grew up in Maine. I had just graduated college with an anthropology degree in 2001. And I was going back to grad school to get my graduate degree in archaeology. But that year in between, I was working for one of my professors out in the field. And so I was doing field work in archaeology. And I happened to be in the field on 9/11, way down by the Canadian border. And I tell people I might be one of the last people on the East Coast to even know we were under attack. But I came home from the field covered in dirt, like been digging all day doing an archaeological project. And I came in, I turned on the television expecting Sports Center is going to have, baseball highlights. And instead, Sports Center had the towers collapsing. And I just sat there on the bed and just in shock. I didn't know what I was watching, what I was seeing. And watching those images of firemen, of law enforcement officers, of paramedics rushing towards the chaos, directing people away from it, taking care of people. I felt this tremendous sense of yearning to have that sort of purpose in my life. I felt like what I had signed up to do for my career all of a sudden was no longer necessary. It was no longer relevant. I wanted to be somebody who was more indispensable in a time of crisis. And that's when it started for me. I immediately that week, I called the FBI recruiter down in Boston. I said, how do I get on board? What do I do? And he said, well, do you speak Urdu? Do you speak Pashtun? Do you speak Farsi? Do you speak Arabic? I said, no, I speak a little French. Does that help? And he said, absolutely not. He said, have you been, were you Delta? Were you, SWAT team? Were you any sort of like tactical experience that we could draw from? He said, no, I got my, my merit badges, my marksmanship merit badge. Does that help? No close quarters combat merit badge. No, sir. And so he basically told me, thank you, but we're really looking for people with forensic accounting skills, people with tactical skills, people with language skills right now because of this new emerging threat. About a week later, not even a week later, my boss gets a call from that same office, that same FBI office. And what they asked for was they weren't looking for me. They were looking for people with our skill set, people who are archaeologists to come down to ground zero and help excavate. They weren't even calling it ground zero at the time. I think they were still calling it the pile. But they wanted us to come down and help in the recovery efforts because it was no longer a rescue effort. It was a recovery effort. And people were sitting around like the guys we were out in the field were all sitting around saying, why do they want archaeologists? And my boss had to explain. He said, listen, you guys, your job is to find very small, tiny, fragmentary pieces of evidence. That's what you do. That's what an archaeologist does. You're looking for 15,000-year-old pieces of stone or bone that tells a story. The FBI needs people with that skill set because when 200-story office buildings collapse, the evidence is fragmentary. It's tiny. Whether we're talking human remains, we're talking pieces of evidence from the airplanes, and that made still I get goosebumps thinking about it. It made the blood run out of my body. I just felt like the shivers. It was the first time it really truly felt real what we were looking at on those television screens. It put it in a different perspective for me, and that just made me double down. We never got called to answer the question that everybody asked. We never got called. We all signed up. We all volunteered, but there were so many volunteers in those days that that list never worked its way down to us, but we were on that list of people who had volunteered to excavate ground zero. And I'm thankful for it 20 years later that I didn't go, just given the amount of cancers and diseases that have those people have had to suffer through and deal with. Those folks are heroes as well, but that set me on the path. And it took a couple of years for DHS to start up. After 9/11, the federal hiring shut down. They rearranged the government. They created this brand new department, kind of this Franken department from all the pieces of other departments. They smashed together into this new thing. And as soon as they opened up jobs and started hiring, I just shotgunned out my application to anything that had a law enforcement focus that was focused on immigration, in large part because the people who attacked us had come in on visas. They had overstayed visas. And in my heart, I wanted to make sure that I was going after those guys. I wanted to make sure that could never happen again. And I figured the best place to do that was with Homeland Security.
It's absolutely amazing, that really the forensic science, right? I mean, that's what you explain there as far as, looking at the tiny details and everything else.
Yeah.
So often in leadership, people get themselves pigeonholed into, I make widgets, right? Or I do this or that. And they stop and forget what they're actually doing. And that's something, it was like you stated, looking for the small details, right? That was a skill set. It didn't have to do with, and I don't know what kind of archaeology you were doing, but it wasn't looking for dinosaur bones. It was looking for small details, right?
Yeah.
It was looking for traces of something that led you to something bigger, right? So I think it's a really important point.
I have an interesting sort of theory about my life that that you just kind of open the door to. When I was in college, I worked for my college newspaper. It was a hobby. I liked to write. I enjoyed it. So it was a way to make beer money on the side. It was like $10 an article. And I was like, heck yeah, I can do that. So I would, cover student council meetings and, whatever, concerts on campus, the softball game, whatever. I covered whatever they needed me to, and I wrote about it. And I was a good writer and enjoyed it. And when I got out of college, or actually when I finished working for my professor, I went back to graduate school. I took on some freelance work as well. I worked for like penny savers and newspapers to make a couple extra bucks. And then I went into I was in archaeology, right? And then I was in law enforcement. And people might look at that and say, is there any sort of connecting thread there? And the thread that I think is interesting, that's connected all the way through there and then also into my life as a speaker and an author now, is the ability to find facts and tell a story that's impactful for people. And so whether I was writing as a newspaper reporter, whether I was working as an archaeologist, whether I was doing criminal investigations, whether I'm writing a book, what I'm trying to do at the core of my person, of who I am, is to try to find facts and interesting things and use those things to tell a story to an audience. And I never thought of it that way until, a few months ago. And I kind of started like ruminating on it. And I realized, I'm like, that's all I am at heart. The job, the career is irrelevant. What I am at my core is a person who enjoys digging into the truth and telling the story about it.
That's interesting, because it really transcends what we all do, in our careers and, in leadership as a whole. So taking that next step, you talked about being at the southern border before the telephone scams.
Yeah.
So southern border, of course, I don't have it on right now, but I usually wear a bracelet that says fentanyl is terrorism, right? Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is that southern border. So it actually got the hairs on the back of my neck to stand up, Christopher, when you mentioned it. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I applied for, like I said, I shotgunned out applications. I applied for Border Patrol. I applied for Customs and Border Protection. I applied for this new agency called ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And I went through the hiring process with all of them, and it was kind of like, the federal process is very slow. It takes time. It's just, nobody's incentivized to work that hard in the federal government, unfortunately, and HR especially. So it took its time. But I got a phone call. The first one that called me and offered me a job was ICE. And they said, hey, we've got a job down in Raymondville, Texas. And I doubt many folks listening have ever heard of it, because I sure hadn't. And Raymondville, Texas is a small town in the Rio Grande Valley. It's about an hour or so from the port of entry in Brownsville. And it's a farming community largely, but most people would know it if you've ever been down to South Padre Island. It's kind of the last town before the Border Patrol checkpoint when you're heading northbound. So, people know it as a place that they stop and fuel up and get a cup of coffee or whatever before they carry on north. And so I got sent down there, and it was 2,600 miles from home. My first duty station, I grew up in Portland, Maine. I get sent down to the southern border, complete culture shock, completely out of sorts. And I end up down there, and my first day on the job, I got assigned to a staging area where all the people who are being arrested by Border Patrol or ICE or Customs and Border Protection, the various entities that kind of patrol the border, are all kind of getting thrown into this same what we call a staging area. And we're bringing these bodies in and we're screening them, and then we're sending them off to, depending on their criminal history, depending on what country they're from, we're sending them off to different bed space. Back when we used to actually detain people, we were sending them off to different detention centers. And we would sit there and bring these and kind of go through their files, create their files, whatever. And I sat there on that first day, and there were two guys from Libya that were sitting there in the waiting area. Each of them had like $10,000 to $15,000 cash on them. Of course, we call the FBI. They bring in their JTTF guys, Joint Terrorism Task Force guys, to talk to them and interview them. And that's when I realized, like, I thought, hey, I'm getting assigned down here. I'm probably dealing with a lot of people just crossing the border for economic reasons, whatever. I realized that the entire world, even then, almost 20 years ago, was coming across that southern border, and that, you're going to sit down your first day on the work, and you're going to see people from 20 different countries coming into the staging area, and you're going to have to process them and interview them and send them out. You don't know what their criminal history is, where they came from. And by and large, back in those days, we were dealing mostly with Central Americans, mostly folks from places like El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, places like that. And so we're bringing those folks in and processing them and sending them back. And that included a lot of MS-13s, a lot of 18th Street gang members, but we weren't dealing with a ton of fentanyl or a ton of opioids at the time. That really started a couple years after I got there. That I heard of fentanyl for the first time back in like 2010 or so, long before people knew what that was. I was assigned to a DEA task force, and we were dealing with large amounts of liquid fentanyl coming across, China white heroin. I mean, you name it. Everything is coming across that border. And we can get into this if you want to, but just the idea of when you flood the border with people, as has happened over the last couple of years, everything else is so much easier to come across. When you are actually controlling the flow of people at your border, and you're actually stopping people who are coming across, and there's consequences for crossing the border, you're getting sent back, it allows the resources to be better apportioned, so that you've got people who are actually there stopping the dope and stopping the really dangerous people coming across. But when you're just flooding the zone with human beings, I don't even want to tell you what I think is happening on the outside the boundaries of where we're seeing those large amounts of people coming across. It's horrible. So, yeah, I spent about 10 years down there, Rio Grande Valley, worked with both ICE and with Internal Affairs, which is the Office of Inspector General. I did public corruption investigations. I did dirty, corrupt agents left and right. We were in the thick of things as the Zetas and the Gulf Cartel. We're in the middle of a very, very brutal and long-standing civil war, and just kind of got to see all of that. And you learn. I tell people this: if you want to go into a law enforcement career, go join the Border Patrol. Go join a department that works in that area, and you will learn in dog years. You will absolutely learn more in a year than you would learn in 10 years in a city or a town in the interior. So it was I lived a lot of years in a decade on the border.
I would imagine. So just looking at that, right? I mean, I totally agree with you with flooding the borders and, the massive amounts of people coming through. But yeah, let's pull on that string just a little bit, right? What was your one of your craziest stories from going across the border that you can share?
Ooh, I mean, there's a lot. This is a good one to look up. First of all, I can tell you a couple stories. One, if you really want to focus on leadership, I can tell you about how I put my boss in jail. That's a good one from a leadership perspective. But the one that probably got the most press that you can look up is a story about the Hidalgo County, Texas, which is where McAllen, Texas is, Edinburgh, Texas. It's a very large border county. It sits across from Tamaulipas, Mexico, so the state of Tamaulipas, and the big city there is called Reynosa. It's a huge city. It's kind of like if you think of the Texas communities as the tip of the iceberg, it's much, much larger population on the southern side of the border. And so it's a massive area, and there was a group there of law enforcement who were related to, one of them was the son of the Hidalgo County Sheriff, and they set up almost like a training day sort of group where they were ripping off, if you're familiar with the movie Training Day, they were ripping off drug dealers. They were stealing their dope. They were selling it to other drug dealers, and they were running and gunning for about 2 years. And the group that I was part of, the Border Corruption Task Force, got a ton of tips about these guys and realized this was a big network of very highly connected law enforcement officers. And we worked on that case for a good amount of time. I wasn't the lead agent on it, but I was part of every single operation. We ultimately ended up bringing down about 15 guys, including the sheriff himself, in this dope running scheme. And they were all just corrupt, dirty cops. And Rolling Stone wrote a big article about it. It's kind of interesting to read in hindsight. I was involved in a bunch of stuff that got a lot of press that unfortunately, is sort of a claim to fame. But to get back to that thing I told you about, probably the most interesting thing that happened to me was I caught my own boss involved in a criminal conspiracy, and had to stand up as a whistleblower and blow the whistle on that and go through that process for about 3 years, ultimately leading to him going to federal jail.
Yeah. So what did the boss actually do? I mean, what was the crime that you...
It was about the stupidest crime of all time. And so my agency at that time that I was with was the Office of Inspector General. It was the internal affairs entity for DHS. So our mission was to investigate fraud, waste, and abuse within the department. And that included corrupt employees. That included any allegation of wrongdoing or misconduct by a Border Patrol agent, by a CBP officer, you name it. And we had a very small office. There were only about 10 of us, and there were thousands upon thousands of employees of the Department of Homeland Security around us. So there was just constant flow of cases and allegations coming in that we had to triage and look at and investigate. My boss was fairly new at the job. He was hired almost by acclamation. He was the only guy in the office who actually wanted the job. Most people were not interested in it, and so it was kind of like he failed upwards into it. So he wasn't necessarily the best person for the job. He just happened to be the one who was selected. And he had a lack of confidence, suffered a tremendous lack of confidence, and didn't have a really good head on his shoulders about what types of cases we should be opening. Because when you only have 8 or 10 guys and you've got that many allegations coming across, you can really only effectively investigate a handful of cases per agent. So you should really be taking the most meaty cases, the cases that have the best allegation, the best founded allegation, that come from sources that you trust. And you should work hard on those, because if you flood the zone and open too many bad cases, nobody's getting anything done. And you could apply that across any number of industries, right? Bosses need to remove problems from their people's way instead of creating them. He was creating them. He gets word, or we all get word, that a headquarters inspection unit is making the rounds, and they check out a couple offices every year. They're going to come down and check out our office this year. And he freaks out because he realizes, I've really screwed up. I've assigned out too many cases. My guys aren't productive. Morale is in the tank. Things are bad. And I'm going to get my wrist slapped hard when this inspection team comes down and sees what a mess I've made of this office. And so in advance of this inspection, he gets a couple of the guys in the office together that have a real desire to promote, and he kind of works towards, he leverages that, this interest these guys have in their own advancement. And he says, listen, they're going to look at these case files. We've got to put some stuff in these case files that makes it look like more has been done than has been done. And so he created basically a criminal conspiracy to avoid an administrative wrist slap. And they papered over files. They put memorandums and files. These are real case files. And, so this is this is the worst thing you could do as a criminal investigator, is lie. And to lie in the case file that where the person on the other end of that case file could potentially go to jail because of your lies is incredible. And just pure dumb luck on my part. I happened to be walking to fill up my coffee cup in the break room as these guys were meeting in the conference room, the next room over. And I'm filling up my coffee cup, and I'm kind of hearing what's going on in the other room. And I realized what was happening. And ultimately I blew the whistle to the inspectors on what I knew. And my boss went to jail for 37 months. He went to federal prison for 37 months. 4 or 5 of my colleagues got scattered to different offices. They got sent out to different offices after they were cleared of wrongdoing, but they had their names dragged through the mud because of their association with this. And then another guy was forced into an early retirement, and another guy went to jail for a year. So I was not the most popular guy in my agency at that time, but it was the right thing to do. You have to stand up and stand on your morals, stand on your principles, and recognize and understand that when you're in a law enforcement setting, you have to be held to a higher standard. And if you're going to do something like that, if you're willing to lie about that, what aren't you willing to lie about? And are those really people that you want to go through a door with? Are those people that you want to entrust your life to?
Yeah, 100%. I think there's a lot of leadership lesson within that, right? Um, you're not always going to be the most popular in the decisions that you make, but you're in a position that you got to make them, right?
Yeah.
So the thing that sucks in that story, though, is how many people actually step into those roles that they're either unqualified for, don't really want, things like that. And sometimes we put people into positions where we set them up to fail, right? So I think there's also that lesson within it, that this guy wasn't suited for the job, but he was selected and placed into that role.
That is very much a federal government problem, and I'm sure it exists in the private sector, but the federal government has a real long-standing history of promoting problems. And what that means is they don't want to promote the guy who is the guy who's grinding and hustling and bringing home good cases, because when you promote a producer, you've got to replace that production, and that's hard to do. But when you promote a problem, that's someone else's problem now. And there is a ton of that in the federal government. And I talk a lot about the iron law of oligarchy, the idea that no matter how altruistic an organization is, no matter how public focused their intended function is, at some point they're going to evolve to serve the people at the top of the organization. And that is a true rule of personnel. It's a true rule of human resources, and it exists in every single organization. But I think it exists at a higher level in government entities where it's difficult to fire people, it's difficult to remove people, and you get a lot of that. You get a lot of promoting of problems. You get a lot of screw up, move up. You get a lot of failing upwards. However you want to phrase it, it happens a ton. I don't know if it happens in the military. I was not in the military myself, but I assume that they're not immune from it. And what ends up happening is you have guys in my position, right? Let's say you work in a border patrol station or a CBP. You work at a port of entry, and you're a worker. You're the kind of guy who likes to get out there and arrest a big group of aliens or arrest a dope, a dope smuggling attempt or human trafficking event that's going on. You're out there in the field getting your boots dirty. There's always going to be somebody who doesn't want to be in that position. There's always going to be somebody who we refer to them as sugar boots, the kind of guys who want to keep that nice, pretty clean shine on their boots. And they don't want to get out there in the dust. They want to keep that press in their pant. The problem that occurs is, while you're out there busting your hump in the field and doing the hard work, those guys are inside the station, kissing someone's butt and brown nosing. And when the promotions come down, well, you've been working, they've been politicking. And we see a lot of that in the federal government too. There's a ton of people who promote because of patronage, because of just who they're friends with and buddies with. And if you asked me, if you made me king for a day and said, how would you fix federal law enforcement? Man, I would get rid of all of that. I would go strictly into a merit-based promotions process that has nothing to do with who you know. It has everything to do with what you've done and what you've demonstrated in the field, from a standpoint of what do the guys on the line with you think about you, not what do the people above you think about you.
Yeah, I would agree with that for the most part. But how do you make sure that those people are good leaders at the same time?
Yeah, I think there's a difference, and I'm sure you talk about this a lot. There's a big difference between a manager and a leader, right? Rank does not make you a leader. Title does not make you a leader. You find the leaders in almost any entity that you go and spend time with. You find the leaders by looking around at who is naturally the person that people are going to with their problems, who is naturally the person that is being selected by their peers. And that, to me, is the best demonstration of leadership. I want to know, when I walk into an entity or an organization, who's the guy that is most well respected by the people doing the job. And that tells me all I need to know about their leadership skills and abilities. We can teach them to manage. We can teach them, how the rule book works. You can't teach that, though. You can't necessarily teach that natural ability to communicate with people, to be the guy that, it's like the team captain on the sports team, right? You get elected by your peers to be the team captain. That doesn't give you necessarily a leadership role in the organization. You're not the coach. You're not the general manager. But your peers think that you are the best representation of who they are as a team. And that, to me, is what a true leader is.
I like that definition a lot. I would disagree, though. You can teach it. It's just a different skill set, and the person doesn't necessarily need it to fulfill their current job, right? So it's or even when they get that management role, right? True leadership can be taught, but it's also it has to be wanted at the time, right? Unlike a tactical skill like management skills are.
That's a fair point. I've been to a number of leadership schools, and I've been to followership schools as well, and that's something that's taught. There's different courses you can take to learn how to be better at following others, and and I think there is a skill set there. Absolutely, I think there's a natural inclination where people elevate their peers because they see the work that they do, they see their communication skills, they appreciate certain assets and qualities about them that make certain people maybe more naturally predisposed to a leadership role than others. But by and large, yeah, I think there's a lot of managers in the federal government. I think there's a lot of people who have rank and title. And the unfortunate side effect of rank and title is thinking that you know more than you do because you've been put in a position to make decisions. And a lot of people forget what they don't know when they get elevated into those positions. And that's always been something that frustrates me is, look, like having rank and title does not make me the smartest guy in the room. And if you listen to any, Navy SEAL talking about leadership, Dan Crenshaw talks about this in his book. Jocko Willink talks about this. You talk to those guys who have everything on the line, and they're going to tell you that sometimes the new guy has the absolute best idea for how we all have this target, right? We've got to take down this house. And we've all got our opinions about how to do it. Maybe all of our opinions are valid. Ultimately, the leader is the person, or the person who's got rank is the person who has to find the best idea among all the ideas, right? They have to make the final decision. But the best leaders are listening to everybody. And if it's the guy who is like brand new guy, hasn't even been on a single mission, but he brings up something that makes good tactical sense, and you ignore that because what's on your shoulders or what's on your epaulets, you're not a good leader. You've got to be willing to know what you don't know and to lean into that and recognize when other people know more than you and have a skill set that maybe you don't have, and rely on those people. That to me is lacking oftentimes in more paramilitaristic organizations, and it's unfortunate.
Oh, totally agree. And it's in private sector too. I mean, it's it's very apparent, right? We want to look at metrics and this, that, and the other, and what have you, but we don't look at how many people are actually following that person, right?
Yeah.
And we have a lot in the private sector. We have a lot of fill in the file folders full of junk.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's just not a crime here.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it is. I mean, 18 USC 1513 is very much a crime, and obstruction of a federal inspection was very much a crime. And Gene Pedraza spent 37 months in the Federal Bureau of Prisons because of it. So I can attest that it is a crime. But yeah, the best leaders that I've ever had, whether it was in the federal government or the private sector, are people who remove obstacles and who are humble and recognize what they don't know, and their entire idea, their operating system is, how do I make the producers, how do I make the people that are doing work and making me look good, how do I make their jobs and lives easier, and how do I facilitate that? And for us in the federal government, the best leaders are the people who stood behind or stood in between the people up at headquarters, those people who live in that rarefied air around Washington, D.C., where all the good ideas come from, right? They stood between those people and the people out in the field who are actually charged with doing the job. That you cannot replace that. If you've got somebody good in that role, somebody who stands kind of as a vanguard in between just the BS that you're getting on a daily basis from that 202 area code and you doing your job, you cannot replace that. That's the best leaders I've ever had, are the guys who play that role.
Agreed. So, internal affairs, right? A lot of people probably wouldn't think that, Border Patrol, ICE, Homeland Security, that those people would need internal affairs. Why is there such a great need?
Every single government agency, so every single department, I should say, every department level, cabinet level department has an inspector general's office, and some of the independent agencies have their own as well. But every single agency has some form of office of professional responsibility, like the HR department, as it were. And so it's like any entity with, I mean, the Customs and Border Protection is the largest law enforcement entity in the nation. So you've got over 20,000 law enforcement personnel. You're going to have a certain percentage of any organization that is not a high performer, or is at worst somebody who is willing to do things the wrong way. And every single government entity, the temptation there for procurement fraud, grant fraud exists as well, contract fraud, because there are billions upon billions of dollars flowing from the taxpayers through the federal government, and there are not enough employees to do all this work. So there's a ton of contracts. There's a ton. I mean, everything from the janitorial contract to the, car maintenance contracts. I mean, think about all the billions of dollars that flows through. So it's necessary to have a certain percentage of your workforce tasked with looking for problems in the system. And I took great pride in that, because I got to be the safeguard for the taxpayers. I got to be the person who said, if, part of my job, if there was a FEMA event, if there was a disaster and the government comes down and throws money at the problem, my office's job is to come and look and see, did people get paid who shouldn't have gotten paid? Did people file fraudulent claims? Did people take advantage of a natural disaster to take money away from people who needed it? And so there's good work being done. But the biggest reason we need it on the border, the biggest reason that I existed and the job that I have was so important on the border, is because the cartels pay better than we do. And, when you've got, and federal government plays very well. I mean, most of your Border Patrol agents are making six-figure salaries, but when those guys are down on the border, any number of people can have money problems, right? You can go through a divorce, you can go through, a bankruptcy, you can go through some sort of issue that makes you vulnerable. And if you have a badge and a gun, that is a very powerful incentive for people on the other side of the border to help you get right, when you go through those problems. And so we saw a fair amount of that. I wouldn't say that it's a high percentage of guys. It's a very, very low percentage of guys. But there is always going to be a certain percentage of people who are willing to take that bribe, who are willing to do that favor, who are willing to start down that slippery slope. And having guys like me there to be a check against that is hyper important.
Yeah, and even at six figures, right? There's a big difference in between 200 and 400,000.
Yeah,
right.
it's a big difference between what the cartels can offer you, cash, no taxes, and and what the IRS is going to know about your salary too. So, and the biggest issue that we saw, and this really comes down from a leadership perspective, this comes down to mistakes that were made in the post 9/11 hiring surge. We saw a lot of, prior to 9/11, if you wanted to join the Border Patrol and you were from Brownsville, Texas, your first duty station was not going to be Brownsville, Texas. They're going to take you from that border community. They're going to send you to San Diego, or they're going to send you to El Paso, somewhere where you don't know anyone. And the reason for that is it eliminates the risk that you're going to be at the grocery store and you're going to bump into your cousin's buddy who's a dope smuggler or an alien smuggler, a trafficker, because that happens in the Rio Grande Valley. There are a lot of people who have family on both sides of the border, who have connections on both sides of the border, who have family that are, have been in trouble with the law. There's unfortunately a bit of an industry around smuggling, narcotics trafficking. It goes back for generations. And there are people who, just like there are people who are born into and grow up in law enforcement families, there's people who are born into and grow up in smuggling families. And if you went to high school with some of those folks, you played soccer, you were friends with those guys, and then your kids are growing up together, going to the same schools, that wall between what's right and what's wrong, it gets thinner and thinner, right? And it becomes easier to breach. And so we stopped doing that. We stopped taking people from Brownsville and putting them in San Diego and vice versa when that post 9/11 hiring surge happened. And a large degree of what I was doing when I was in the Rio Grande Valley, the cases that I was working, were directly related to people who had been hired post 9/11 and put in positions where they were more vulnerable or more likely to be turned by friends, family members, et cetera, on the other side of the border. And hopefully we've corrected a lot of those problems and mistakes through good investigations. But it opened up a lot of vulnerabilities.
Yeah, that's interesting, right? And we're probably still dealing with with those kind of things today, even,
Yeah. Yeah. And you get, I mean, you can, you can see it in the press releases that come out from Southern District of Texas, which is where I'm located in the Houston area. That, there's probably 3, 4, or 5 times a year you're going to see a press release where it's a corrupt Border Patrol agent or customs officer has been arrested for X, Y, and Z, and it still happens. It's not as big of a problem as it was, I would say, in 2008, 9, 10, around that time. Uh, Around that time, post 9/11, when that hiring surge happened, the cartel saw an opportunity as well. They said, listen, we've got, people who are not related, or we've not people who are not related, but we've got people who are um, people that we would like to see go off to a law enforcement academy. It's kind of like in The Departed, where you've got the cop who has been raised from a young boy to go and join the Massachusetts State Police so that he can be an insider for the mobsters. That same thing was happening in real life on the southern border. There were people who were tapped and identified as my Border Patrol agent, my customs officer, and they were going off to the academy and getting brought on board so they could serve the cartels. So I'm sure that still happens. I think it's happening less and less these days because we've kind of gotten through that mass hiring that allowed a lot of these things to occur.
Right. So what took you from there to the telephone scams?
Again, dumb luck. I in my career in the Rio Grande Valley, like I said, I'm raised in New England. I was not a native Spanish speaker. My Spanish language skills are still pretty limited. I'm more conversational than I used to be, but early on in my law enforcement career, it was basically limited to, manos arrive and, firma aquí and, that sort of stuff, like telling people like law enforcement Spanish was what I had. And so running a source, like having a confidential informant in the Rio Grande Valley typically requires you to have pretty decent Spanish language skills because you're talking to a guy who is either from Mexico or is bilingual and he's working with the cartel, and that's where you're getting your intel from. I couldn't really do that effectively, so I had to play second fiddle on a lot of cases, and I wanted to be a bigger asset to my agency. And so I told my boss one day, I said, listen, like, internal affairs is kind of like a three-legged stool. You've got, procurement and grant and contract fraud, you've got public corruption, you've got kind of miscellaneous, but you have to have all those things being investigated. You can't just focus all our assets on the internal affairs side of things, on the employee corruption. We have to have somebody looking into the fraud. And I volunteered. I said, listen, I'll be the fraud guy. I came out of, a relatively data heavy profession beforehand with archaeology. You had to be pretty organized and know your way around a spreadsheet. I said, listen, I'm pretty organized in that way. I have a good head for money. Let me do the fraud stuff. And so those things started getting dropped on my desk. And I was sitting there one day, he brought in something. He said, hey, listen, we got some phone calls from some people in Houston. They've been called by the federal government, and DHS called them and threatened them with deportation if they didn't pay these fines. It could be an employee who's threatening these people. You want to look into this? I said, sure, no problem. I started scratching the surface on it, and pretty quickly, a couple subpoenas into it, realized this is not an employee. This is a call center based in India, and we were kind of off to the races from there. Turned it into the largest tele-fraud case in U.S. history over the next 7 years.
Yeah, that's. I think I remember all that stuff going on too. I mean, I think I got a couple calls myself.
I think everybody did. Yeah, I talked to over not personally, but my team interviewed over 17,000 victims in the course of our investigation, which is an incredible amount of people. It wasn't just the guys on my team. We outsourced a lot of that to other people in different offices to take those calls and triage them. But over 17,000 victims. And what I like to tell people is that probably represents maybe 1% of the actual victims who lost money, because most of the people, our average age of our victims was 73. And if you think about it, if you get called and you get scammed and you're that age, you don't want to tell your kids about it. You don't want to go to the police about it. You feel embarrassed about it. You feel like you're going to be a burden to your children because you lost their inheritance. There were a lot of those stories out there that never got told because people just kept that information to themselves. So when I say 17,000 victims, I think that is maybe a portion of 1 percentage point of the actual number of victims.
Way low.
Yeah.
And it seems like it's on the rise again, with internet and all the social media apps and everything else. I would imagine that department is huge now.
The every group has their own calling card. And the people that I was looking into, the people who do government impersonation scams or Amazon refund scams, tech scams, the Microsoft scams, they call and tell you, your computer is sending signals that needs to be, software needs to be. Those typically are coming from India. The people who are doing the advanced fee frauds, the grandson in jail scams, the you go to buy a puppy on Craigslist and you got to put a deposit down and all this. Those people tend to be West African. There are different kind of hallmarks and calling cards for different groups of scammers. And most of my efforts, I did some West African stuff, but most of my efforts were focused on India-based call center frauds. And that, by and large, is the government impersonation stuff. Nowadays, they're heavily into impersonating Social Security Administration. They still do some IRS. They still do some other stuff, but they're a little bit more nervous about the IRS stuff after what we did to them. So they don't impersonate IRS quite as much anymore. But yeah, they impersonate anyone and everyone. And the technology, AI, auto dialers, voice over IP, the better the technology is for us on the legal side of things, the better it is for the scammers too. And they take full advantage of that and are using it with even greater utility than we are.
Yeah, that's their full-time job, is figuring that stuff out, right?
Yeah, they're professionals at it. And that's I tell folks when I would talk to victims, they'd be embarrassed. They'd feel terrible. I cannot believe that I lost this money. I can't believe I lost this money. I feel so awful. Yeah, well, you're a professional at what you do, right? You're very good at your job. Consider if you were doing this all day, every day, if your job was to extract money from people, you would practice your verbal judo. You would be able to overcome objections. I look at telephone scammers, and I hate to say, people in sales get angry at me when I say this, but a good scammer and a good salesman have a very similar technique. It's just whether you're using it for good or evil, right? It's like the ability to get someone under the ether, the ability to get somebody to believe that you have a solution to their problem, the ability to get someone to know, like, and trust you, the ability to find rapport when you're talking to someone. Those skills are directly transferable between sales and scams. It's just the scammers are doing it for an evil purpose, and salesmen in theory are doing it to help somebody, right? They're doing it to provide an actual solution, although not always. I bought some things I didn't need, I guess.
Oh, 100%. Yeah. I don't know why they're getting angry. I mean, they're one and the same.
They got to know. I mean, they have to understand that the skill set's the same, right? You're teaching people. When you get a telephone call, for instance, like let's say you get a scam call, the psychology of a scam call is fascinating to me. Individuals will try to get you to say yes. That's the goal. The goal is to try to get you to say yes and to lock you into saying yes and saying yes again and again and again, right? And the more you say yes, the better the chances are that ultimately you're going to say yes to the thing that they want you to really say yes to. And so it's the same with sales. I mean, it's the same sort of like positive affirmation and using urgency and using scarcity. All the same techniques and tactics exist.
Man, I never thought in a million years that fraud would be so exciting.
You still get to kick a lot of doors too. I mean, these guys, like, the fascinating thing towards the end of my career when the Paycheck Protection Program and economic injury disaster loans and everything that came out of the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, all that stuff, there was so much fraud in 2020, 2021 related to this just massive, just carpet bombing of the American economy with printed money. There was so much fraud that organized crime, like gangs, we're talking like the Crips and the Bloods, started doing Paycheck Protection Program grant applications and loan applications on a massive scale. And so towards the end of my career, we're dealing with a lot of that. And if you look, if you look in the different U.S. attorneys' offices, press releases on their websites, you're going to see a ton of that right now. You're going to see criminal organizations that you consider violent street crime. More than likely, you're thinking the Crips or Bloods is violent street crime, right? These people are not engaged in that right now. They are deeply engaged in tele-fraud and scams and other government loan scams, anything that they can do. And they dove headfirst into that in 2020 and 2021. So, when you go out there and you do a search warrant, you're still doing a search warrant on a Blood gang member's place. You're not doing a search warrant necessarily for drugs or whatever else are involved, and you do a search warrant for a fraud case, but it doesn't make it less dangerous, right?
Roll up to the dope house, kick the door in, and there's a call center.
That's it. I mean, no, like we're finding, like when we were doing search warrants, we're finding, I mean, like, like stored value cards, those like gift cards that they use to transfer things, or you're getting like, you want to know what their Cash App is. You want to see their phones because they're like flipping stuff on Cash App left and right. So yeah, I mean, you're finding dope and guns too, but like you're really like going there for a fraud case, and it's hardened street criminals have turned to white collar crime because that's where the money is right now.
Yeah. Probably a lot less risk too, because there's so many people out there doing it, and then you add the shame and everything else on top of it.
You're not shooting each other over street corners when you're doing Paycheck Protection Program grant fraud, right? So it's a safer way to make that money too. And I think they feel like they're looking at, and it's probably true as well. When you're looking at prison sentences associated with these things, you're probably going to do less time ultimately when you're doing white collar crime as well.
Oh, 100%. So looking at your hat, right? Got Team Never Quit up on the hat. Tell us, how in the world do you go from looking at southern border, internal affairs? I'm imagining, the suspenders and button-up shirt digging in the dirt, right? All of that to Team Never Quit.
Again, like I feel like I've got a lot of luck on my side, and and I understand preparation and hard work and all that stuff creates luck. I get that. I'm not discounting that. I've worked very, very hard in my life to get where I am and to have the career that I've had. But it also does come down to connections, and it comes down to who you meet over time and demonstrating value to people. And so I think we were talking offline. I may have mentioned it online, but my wife. As my career was going on, my wife was building an entrepreneurial endeavor where she started out as a personal trainer, and then she grew a brand out of it and was training people and working with people, and then eventually created this large scale consulting business where she actually helps other entrepreneurs in the health and fitness space launch their programs and brands. And so as she was building all of that along the way, she worked with some folks that were close friends with Marcus Luttrell from famous for being the lone survivor. And of course, they made the movie about him, the book. If you haven't read it, you should read. And became friends with his wife and friends with some people in his orbit. So they became close. And so they were kind of in the Team Never Quit people were kind of in our orbit. We knew about them. And then when I left my federal job, I had the opportunity to I had done a lot of public speaking in my federal job. I had been an instructor at the academy. I had taught at a lot of different conferences and different things where I had developed that skill set. And, a good friend of mine, Adam Davis, who is a fairly well-known author in the law enforcement and faith. He speaks a lot about faith and writes a lot about faith from a law enforcement perspective. He was actually working with Team Never Quit. And so just kind of all these connections sort of dragged me into that orbit. And I got invited to join on and do public speaking with them since I was already pretty adept at it. And Adam kind of opened the door for me and said, "You really got to bring this guy on. I've been working with him a lot. He's great." And so it just kind of happened. And I found myself in one of those situations where you don't ever want to turn down an opportunity that incredible, where you don't ever want to say no to something, even if you're scared of it, even if you're a little bit scared of being on stages at that level or representing a brand that has that much power behind it. To me, I saw it as an opportunity to do something really incredible and to reach and touch more people. And if you can be a part of a brand that has that sort of reach, the ability to get in front of crowds and impact and affect others just amplifies and magnifies. So I saw it as a real opportunity.
No, that's awesome. And I think that's a important point for people to think about too. We always hear these influencers and whatever, just head down, keep on working, it'll come. But if you do that and you don't connect with people and you don't build a network, you're going to do that until you run yourself into the grave, and that's about it, right?
I looked at it as I was very driven as a criminal investigator. I year over year had more stats than anyone else in my agency. I made more arrests than anyone in my agency. I was very, very driven. I loved that job. I was good at it. I enjoyed it. I did it well. And I was very reluctant to embrace a civilian lifestyle when I got out of the federal government. That means, social media and speaking and talking and being in front of people, because I felt like, I was part of this club where you don't speak out of school, you don't talk about certain things, and you're not trying to get credit for it. The deed is all, not the glory, right? The idea that the deed is all that matters, that you're doing the right thing, and that's what we all signed up for. And then I realized when I left, and I'm talking to people and having these conversations, I realized that there's so many people that can be served by the skill set that I learned, and that it's transferable knowledge to people who didn't have the benefit of going through 15 years of the kind of things that I went through and dealt with in law enforcement and across my career. And I looked at guys like Marcus, guys like David Goggins, guys like Jocko Willink, guys like my friend Adam, who are out there telling those stories and going on podcasts and getting in front of crowds and sharing experiences. And I see the impact that they're having on the lives of other men who don't have those experiences. And I thought to myself, you're really doing a disservice to others if you don't take what you've learned over 15 plus years in federal law enforcement and find a way to get that in front of other people and explain to them how they can do things better, how they can be more tactically proficient, give them tips, tools, and tactics to live a life that is more virtuous, more valorous. If you can't do those things, what was the point of all of it, right? You're just going to stare and look at your shelf full of awards and think about how it used to be? No, go out there and share your story and do something that is of value to the people that don't have that experience.
Good segue. You just brought up Valor in there.
There you go.
So let's talk about this new book. I was privileged to be able to get an early digital copy of it. Yeah. So I did some skimming in there, some pretty good words of wisdom, and heavily influenced by the Stoics. So where in the journey did you really connect with Stoicism, and why did you have this drive to build basically every day a message for first responders?
I think Stoicism has always been there, ever since college, and, Philosophy 101, when you first, pick up Meditations by Marcus Aurelius, and, there's a lot of beard stroking. There's a lot of beard stroking philosophy that's very academic, right? That you're talking about Plato's cave and Socrates and, you name it, right? Foucault and Kant and all these others, right? But Meditations, Marcus Aurelius's journals, always felt very practical to me. It felt like a very lived philosophy. Like these are words of advice from a big brother, or from someone who's been there and done that, from someone who's worn the mantle, or who's worn that crown of leadership, who's telling themselves, because the most incredible thing about it is it's a journal that he was writing for himself about how to be a better man, how to be a better leader. It might be the best leadership manual ever written, because it's the emperor of Rome, literally the most powerful man in the world in the 2nd century, as he's writing this, telling himself, just be a good man, the rest does not matter. like telling himself how to deal with adversity, telling himself how to, one of my favorite ones, like the entry from today, from the day that we're recording, is where he says, be strict with yourself and tolerant of others. So I read that stuff in college and thought, this is incredible stuff, and you kind of keep it in your back pocket and you think about it. It really wasn't until I went through putting my boss in jail, dealing with that sort of difficulty of standing firm and doing the right thing in the hardest possible situation, under pressure from your own agency, under pressure from your colleagues and peers, the fear that this is going to blow back on you and have a terrible impact on your career and your ability to promote and all of that stuff. That's when I really dug in and said, listen, you need this advice. You need somebody who, Marcus Aurelius was dealing with the Antonine Plague. 7.5 million Romans died of essentially a smallpox epidemic while he was in charge. He had wars on his eastern front against the Parthian Empire and then the Germanic tribes in the north. I mean, he spent his entire almost 20 years as emperor dealing with just these incredible stresses. He lost 8 children died. His own brother and co-emperor died during his reign. He had a uprising from one of his best friends, led an attempt to usurp his crown. So think about all the stresses and troubles that the emperor of Rome was dealing with, and he's writing in his journal every day, reminding himself, don't let your soul be dyed by the color of the purple. In other words, don't let the fact that you are the emperor go to your head. Be a good man. Like, that to me is an incredible operating manual for anybody who is in a high stress, rapidly evolving job, who's in the kind of job where things are happening on a daily basis that they can't control. They're standing between chaos and order. What better operating manual could there possibly be than the philosophy that allowed him to have such a reasoned, kind of happy warrior outlook on life, right? And so I drew so much strength from that as I was going through what I was going through on the job. And I thought, when I got out, I thought, how great would it be to be able to give the gift, instead of, because I've read it all. I've read, all the original texts, Epictetus and Seneca and Chrysippus and Cleanthes and Zeno and, you name it, Heraclitus, like you name it, I've read all of them. And I thought, how great would it be for people not have to worry about that library full of books, but to have a single resource that would be an operating manual for guys who are in my position, guys who are dealing with a difficult, stressful job. We talked earlier about that threshold check, guys who want to have that threshold check before they come home at the end of the day. This book is designed to give them this, designed to give them some ancient wisdom from people far smarter than me, from these philosophers that lived 2,000 years ago. And then it gives them a story that allows them to kind of see it in a modern context in 2 to 3 paragraphs, and then a journal prompt or an action prompt that allows them to integrate that lesson. And so for me, that was heavy on my heart. It was like, what can I do? Because we have such a PTSD epidemic in law enforcement. We have it's worse in law enforcement percentages than in military. There's a higher percentage of people struggling with PTSD or PTSI, however you want to put it, whether that's disorder or injury. People look at it different ways. But it's a higher percentage of our active duty law enforcement are struggling through PTS symptoms than our military. And if you think about that, like, our military, not to take anything away from them, they're not deploying as much as they were, thank goodness, but they were deploying for a year or 2 years, or maybe they had a 4-year career or an 8-year career, whatever it was. And those are incredibly stressful, concentrated periods of incredible tension and stress. Even if you're not in combat, just being away from family, just being downrange in and of itself is an incredibly stressful thing. Your average law enforcement officer, they've got a 20-year career. And every time they step outside of that door, every time they walk out to their car and they've got their uniform on or their badge and gun on, they're stepping into a war zone for 20 years, right? Every single day. And so if I thought if my contribution to the people who are still in the career that I left behind, if I can make their mindset a little bit better, if I can give them some tools to help collect themselves so that they can catch some of those stressful feelings before they become problematic, before they rise to the level of addiction, rise to the level of self-harm, rise to the level of these other hypertension and stress-related issues that come from that constant amygdala hijack response that we all get in that law enforcement career. If I can give them something that's a tool that helps them regulate their emotions a little bit better on a daily basis, that's the best thing that I could possibly do. And so that was the thought process and the reasoning behind writing it and why I was so proud to have done it. And it's easily the hardest thing I've ever done. Easily.
I'm really intrigued by the percentages of PTSD in law enforcement.
It's high.
And I'm sitting here as you're talking and thinking about the military people that I've talked to, Green Berets, Delta Force, SEALs, and everyone that I've talked to, either on camera or off camera, talks about basically seeing the devil, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, bringing it into a spiritual realm.
Yeah.
But it's, you talked about the length of deployment, right? And it is very intense. It doesn't let up for that period of time, right? Even if it's multiple deployments. I've never thought about that with law enforcement and the length of time, right? And I'm sure there's some intense moments that definitely are equal back and forth, but the length of stay, is different. So that evil to seep in, I never thought about it. So thank you for bringing that to light, Christopher.
It's that sustained sense of hypervigilance, right? That sense that you cannot escape think of it this way. Getting back to the anthropologist, going back to the beginning. This is what we call a callback. So the anthropology student learned that our prehistoric bodies 50,000 years ago were not all that different than they are today, right? When Homo sapiens sapiens arrives on the scene, right? We're not all that different from an evolutionary standpoint in terms of what our bodies feel, in terms of our primitive systems, right? So whether we're being chased by a saber-toothed cat or whether we are kicking a door in and, looking at a double-barrel shotgun in our face, the body feels the same way, that same fight, flight, or freeze. And so many police have issues, and so many military have issues because they don't know how to reduce that feeling, that stress that's inside of their body. And that's really what, that somatic release that needs to happen periodically from that hypertension, that hypervigilance that we all deal with. And I wasn't a patrol officer. I wasn't like pulling people over on felony stops on the midnight shift every single night for 20 damn years, right? I was like, running search warrants pretty regularly. I had a pretty high op tempo, but not like that, right? And so like I only know what I know, but I can only imagine what those guys deal with or are going through on a daily basis when you're, pulling someone over on the side of the road and, by yourself, nearest help is 10 minutes away, and you don't know what this guy's got in his car. And that's the feeling you have every single time you pull someone over, right? And so I think there's a lot of that in law enforcement that doesn't get recognized, and I think it should. So hopefully, having conversations like this give a voice to it, and hopefully books like mine can have some impact and some help on guys that need that help.
No, that's awesome. And I think, just from the little bits that I read of your book, there's some great insights there. And I'm going to keep on continuing reading it because I think it applies, to civilian life as well, right?
Without
I mean, we all have stressors and we need that release, right? So
without a doubt.
Where can people find your book? When's it going to be out? That sort of thing, Chris.
Yeah, so it's on Amazon in Valor, 365 Stoic Meditations for First Responders. It's available on Amazon. It's available wherever you get your books, Barnes & Noble. You can download the e-copy. As we're recording this, it officially goes on sale retail on June 18th. It's available for pre-order as we're recording this, but I've been hearing from some folks that they've got notice that's already shipped. So some folks are going to get it this week as we're recording. But yeah, it's available right there on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever you get your books. Or you can just look up my website, and it's got all the links there. So KristoforHealy.com, spelled the awkward Swedish way.
Kristofor.
So, there it is. Ever since that movie Frozen came out, everybody assumes it's Kristoff, and unfortunately it is not. But yeah.
No, at first I saw it and I'm like, huh. No, I bet you it's Kristofor.
No, it's just the phonetically correct way to spell it, but it screws up people in the United States, and it's like the bane of my existence. Yeah. So if I lived in Norway or Denmark, everyone would get it. They get it, but not here.
Oh, for sure. So you also run a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
So where can they find your podcast at?
Yeah, same. So if you go to my website, you get the links for all of that. But the podcast is called The Stoic Responder, and it is exactly what it sounds like. I just give 3 to 4 leadership lessons a week that are 100% drawn from the wisdom that's in my book. It's the Stoics. I just kind of break it down in a 10 or 15 minute long podcast and just throw that out there so that guys who are sitting in a patrol car somewhere can tune in and listen to it if they just need that like quick hit of wisdom to kind of help center themselves. And that's the entire purpose. So you can look up the Stoic Responder. Periodically, I will have law enforcement guests on there as well, guys that have stories to share and experiences to share. Even people who have law enforcement related businesses, I like to host and have on there because my audience generally trends towards law enforcement. But if you're not law enforcement, if you're not military, if you're not a first responder, you're still going to get value out of it. It's just good wisdom from people much, much smarter than me that lived 2 millennia ago. I'm not the philosopher. I'm just repeating what the philosophers say.
Yeah, but I think there's a special power in being able to translate it into your own experiences and then share that with others, right?
That I think
you don't give yourself enough credit.
Yeah, that's the part that I really enjoy, is being able to try to contextualize some of this stuff into a modern context, because people will tell you what does the Emperor of Rome from the 2nd century know about the stresses of modern policing? And I like to say, well, he operated at a time when there was a pandemic. He operated at a time when there were wars on multiple fronts. He operated at a time when people were crossing his borders illegally. I mean, there was a lot of commonality there in a leadership role, 2,000 years ago to what you're dealing with today. So don't sell them short. Give them a try.
Yeah, the short answer is everything, right?
Yeah.
Well, I appreciate you coming on the cast today, Chris.
Yeah.
This has been fantastic, man. I really appreciate you.
Thanks for having me. This has been a lot of fun. Good conversation.
All right. We'll see you next time here on the Fire Forge Leader podcast.
You have just experienced the heat and pressure of the forge. Remember, words without action are meaningless. Now, after the heat of the forge, shape your thoughts, quench your brain, then put your new tools to use, adding to your leadership. Tune in next week for more lessons from the forge.